All right, let's dive into one of the biggest, most fundamental questions in all of economics. Is it possible for an entire economy to just get stuck? The answer is a wild story, and it's about a beautiful fairy, a truly devastating crisis, and one radical idea that completely changed the game. For the longest time, if you asked an economist this question, the answer would have been a hard no. Of course not. The thinking was that economics were like natural systems. They could always fix themselves. But then reality hit, and it hit hard. And this one question started a debate that honestly still shapes our world today. So, before the 1930s, the way everyone thought about the economy is what we now call classical economics. And the central idea was that the economy was this kind of perfect, self-correcting machine. Really, it was a very elegant and optimistic way of looking at things. Now, the engine powering this machine was a core belief called Say's law. The idea was actually pretty simple. Supply creates its own demand. Think about it. The very act of producing something, say a car, also creates the income needed to buy that car, right? Through wages for the workers, payments to the parts suppliers, and profits for the owners. So, in this view, a big, lasting glut of unsold stuff or unemployed people, well, that was seen as pretty much impossible. So how did this machine supposedly fix itself? Well, the key word was flexibility. If, for some reason, you had some temporary unemployment pop up, no big deal. Wages would just fall until it was cheap enough for companies to hire everybody back. If you had some extra goods sitting on shelves, prices would drop until people bought them all up. Problem solved. The system would always automatically find its way back to full employment. So at the end of the day, the classical view was really built on this rock-solid belief in the economy's power to heal itself. Any downturn, any recession, was just seen as a temporary little blip before the system automatically got back to normal. But what happens when the machine just breaks? Well, a crisis came along that was so deep, so profound, and so long that it didn't just break the economy, it completely shattered the theory that was supposed to explain it. Of course, I'm talking about the Great Depression. And this was not a temporary blip, not even close. The Great Depression was a decade-long catastrophe. The economy crashes in 1929, and by 1939, a full 10 years later, it was still stuck in a ditch. That self-correcting machine was nowhere to be seen. And this is where the classical model just completely fell apart. It had no answer for what people were seeing with their own two eyes. Millions of people desperate for a job, willing to work for almost anything, but there were simply no jobs to be had. This was involuntary unemployment on a massive, terrifying scale, the very thing the theory said couldn't really happen. So, into this total intellectual chaos steps a brilliant British economist, a guy named John Maynard Keynes. He looked at all the economic wreckage around him and basically said, you know what? I think we've been thinking about this all wrong. Keynes's big idea was like a bombshell. He said, everybody's looking in the wrong place. The problem isn't that we can't produce enough stuff. The factories and the workers are still there. The problem is that nobody is spending any money. There was a catastrophic failure of what he called aggregate demand. And this just created this massive intellectual showdown. You had the classical school, totally focused on supply, believing in flexible wages and a self-healing system. And then Keynes comes along and flips the whole thing on its head. He says, no, total demand is the driver. Wages are actually sticky, and an economy can absolutely 100% get stuck. So, what on earth did he mean by sticky wages? It's a hugely important idea. Keynes just looked at the real world and said, hey, wages don't just fall overnight. People have employment contracts, labor unions fight against wage cuts, and, there's just a basic human resistance to being told you're going to make less money next week. This stickiness meant that the classical automatic fix, the idea that falling wages would solve unemployment, it just didn't work in reality. So if wages are sticky, what does that mean? Well, this diagnosis led Keynes to a truly radical conclusion. The economy wasn't really broken, it was just stuck in this awful, self-perpetuating cycle. And man, is it a vicious cycle. Just think it through. It all starts with low spending. If people and businesses aren't buying things, companies have to cut production. When they cut production, what do? They lay off workers. That leads to high unemployment. And what do millions of unemployed people do? Well, they spend even less money, which kicks the whole cycle right back to the beginning. There was no automatic way out of this spiral. This led Keynes to maybe his most revolutionary concept of all, the underemployment equilibrium.
He argued that an economy could find a stable resting point, an equilibrium, but a terrible one, with tons of unemployment. The machine hadn't broken down, it had just settled into this very bad low-power mode, and it would just stay there unless something came along and gave it a really powerful push.
And that led to a pretty radical solution. If the economy can't fix itself, who can? For Keynes, the answer was crystal clear: the government. It was the only player big enough to break that vicious cycle by just stepping in and spending money on roads, bridges, public works, anything really, to create demand out of thin air and push the economy back to life. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's interesting history, but this clash of ideas wasn't just some dusty old academic debate. It's a fundamental argument in economics that is very, very much alive and well today. So who was right in the end? Well, the funny thing is, modern economics has sort of made peace with both ideas. The classical view is now seen as really useful for thinking about an economy's long-run potential, what it's capable of over decades. But the Keynesian view is absolutely essential for understanding and responding to short-run crises, like the recessions we see every few years. They're just two different lenses for two different timeframes. And hey, if this stuff fascinates you and you want to get into the nitty-gritty, a fantastic place to go is Greg Mankiw's Principles of Economics. Specifically, check out Chapter 33, which really breaks down this whole aggregate demand and supply model, and then Chapter 34, which gets into how government policy actually works. It's a great way to build on all these ideas. And that brings us to the final question, the one I want to leave you with. This entire epic debate spanning almost a century, it all boils down to this one question that we still argue about every single day. During a crisis, how much should the government do? The echoes of Keynes versus the classicals are in every single news headline you read. Thanks for tuning in.